morning. This week we're going to look at some of the concepts behind the idea or the theory of evolution. Probably one of the most misunderstood theories of our time. I'm going to start by telling you a quick story about finches, about Charles Darwin, and his finches. Charles Darwin is considered the father of evolution. Him and Alfred Russel Wallace are the two scientists that are, credited with developing this theory. Charles Darwin is the one that actually kind of puts all of the ideas in details and writes a book on it called The Origin of Species. But Charles Darwin, part of his research involves looking at finches that he observed on the Galapagos Islands. So I think the finches is a great story of what evolution is. So in simplified terms, you have a species of bird, a finch. And just like in humans, there are different characteristics of those particular birds that are just differences in genes, homozygous dominant, heterozygous, in a human it might be your hair color or your eye color, There's just different variations that exist within these birds. And one of the variations is the size and shapes of their beaks. So some birds have really thick beaks, for example. Some birds have thin beaks. And whether you have a thick beak or a thin beak is completely determined by genetics, the genes that the parent birds pass on to those offsprings. So when we talk about evolution, we're really looking at traits, genetic traits that are passed on from parents to offspring. So on one of the islands, there is a major drought. And that drought prevents really big plants from growing. So the plants that are growing or that are able to survive are plants that are lower to the ground, and plants that have, those plants typically have thicker seeds. So as those seeds fall to the ground, you have this population of birds with natural variation in their beak size. And those birds that naturally have a thicker beak are better able to get to the thicker seeds and open them and eat them and provide nourishment for themselves. Those birds that have the thinner beaks, they're just not able to do it, to open and deal with those seeds as well as those with the thick beaks. So over time, what's going to happen? Well, the thick-beaked birds are going to get more food, they're going to have more energy to survive, and more importantly, they're going to have more energy to reproduce. And if they're reproducing, then there's a high probability that they're passing on their genes, including the genes for the thicker beak, onto their offspring, to their baby birds, The thin-beaked birds, because they aren't able to get to the food source as well, or use the food source as well, they're not surviving as well. They don't have the energy to reproduce as much as the thicker-beaked birds, and because they're not reproducing, they're not able to pass their thin-beaked genes or alleles on to the next population or the next generation. So over a long period of time, the population of birds are going to change physically because you're going to start to see a lot more thicker-beaked birds than you are thinner-beaked birds, and they're obviously going to be changing genetically in terms of the amount of thick-beaked alleles there are in that population or genes versus the amount of thin-beaked genes or alleles that are in a population. So when we look at evolution and changes in populations, really we're looking at physical changes like what we can see and how those change over time, and then also the genetics, how many of a dominant allele is present, how many of a recessive allele is present. Now over time, something might happen where maybe the environment changes and it starts to favor a thin-beaked bird, in which case the process would reverse. Those birds would be able to survive more often. They would be able to reproduce and pass on their genes to an environment, and thus the population over time would start to look differently and have different percentages of the alleles. So when we talk about evolution and we talk about natural selection, we're really looking at two things. We're looking at traits that are inheritable, so that we can get from our parents, traits that are variable. So like I said, if you want to compare it to humans, let's say that you have a blonde-haired person and a brown-haired person, and for whatever reason the environment favors the survival of a blonde-haired person. Well, they're going to have the energy and to reproduce and pass on their blonde-haired genes to the next generations versus the brown-haired people who aren't, and over time you're going to have a lot more blonde-haired people than you are brown-haired people. And maybe something happens in the environment that changes, that favors a brown-haired person, and again the same thing would happen. The brown-haired people would be able to reproduce and pass those genes on, and you would see a change in the population over time. So we're looking at, heritable characteristics, and we're looking at how those characteristics maybe allows an organism to be better suited for environmental conditions. And those environmental conditions can change. So evolution, I think, oftentimes we equate the idea of evolution with religion, which is crazy because they're two completely different ideas and topics. But really all evolution is the change of species and the populations of species and the traits within a species over a period of time. And as those changes become more and more pronounced and other factors start to come in, then we can get the development of new species, completely new species, because they become so far apart from the original species that they originally came from. So that's the general idea of Darwin's natural selection, which is also called survival of the fittest. We often look at that as a bad thing, but really it's just the idea that those organisms better suited for the environment through natural variations in genes are going to be able to survive, they're going to be able to reproduce, and they're going to be able to pass those genes on then to the next generation. This week you have Chapter 11, reading notes. There's some videos to help you with that, content practice, natural selection simulation using the PhET program, and then you have your evolution exam. There is no Let's Talk this week, so you're down one activity. As always, if you have questions, please feel free to ask. If you have things that you feel like you want to discuss in terms of the differences between the theory of evolution and religion, please feel free to have those conversations with me. I would love to discuss them. Have a great week.